If you're like most people, the idea that the world could be improving probably sounds absurd to you, and who can blame you? Everything around us seems to be getting worse really quickly. I'm not here to argue with you or tell you that you're wrong, but I do really want to shine some light on some actual good news that, for some reason, nobody talks about. For example, did you know that in the last 30 years, the number of people living in extreme poverty around the world has decreased by half? Probably not, because a poll in 2016 showed that 87% of people thought that poverty had stayed the same or gotten worse in the last 20 years. And only 1% actually knew by how much it had gone down. Here's another fact. In almost every year from 1992 to 2015, an era in which the rate of violent crime plummeted, a majority of Americans told pollsters that crime was rising. These stats are a perfect representation of the issue I want to talk about. I can feel in my daily life that people are becoming more and more pessimistic. Nobody seems to realize that there's any good news at all. In fact, most people I talk to are unprepared to accept even the suggestion that things might be getting better. When people hear that I've become an optimist, their initial reaction is to call me naive, ignorant, stupid, even insensitive. I probably would have said the same a few years ago. There's this perception that intelligence is correlated with feeling hopeless, that the more smart you are, the more depressed you must be because you understand the futility of life or whatever, I don't know. For the longest time, I didn't even know that optimism was a real option. I thought that pessimism and realism were the same thing. I mean, only idiots could be hopeful, right? Well, hear me out, because the more I learn about the actual data, the more I realize that there is a case to be made for optimism. A really rational one, in fact. And so that's why in this video, I'm going to try and prove to you why the world might not be as bad as you think, and how in a lot of important ways, it's actually still getting better. But before I do that, I want to say that I get it. A lot of stuff does suck right now, and it's understandable why everyone is so pessimistic. Even if you try and ignore the endless stream of bad news, you probably notice a lot of things getting worse in your daily life. People are becoming more isolated and lonely, skyrocketing prices in recent years, widening wealth inequality, more extreme political polarization, misinformation, and so on. Even from a bigger picture, it looks like everything is cooked. Antimicrobial resistance, global warming, nuclear war. Now I'm hearing about AI taking over the world. I get it, it's a lot, and I'm not trying to downplay any of this stuff. Being an optimist does not mean that you think everything is perfect and everyone's happy and nothing needs to change. I'm not an optimist because I think none of it affects me or that it's not important. And I'm definitely not choosing to be an optimist because I think ignoring everything is the best solution. Optimism is simply the belief that things will get better. But obviously, since no one knows the future for sure, we need to have a reason to believe that things will get better. So my job is to try to prove to you that actually the world has improved a lot in a lot of important ways, really quickly, way more than you realize, and it's still getting better every single day. And so if I'm able to convince you of all that, it's not that unreasonable to assume that this long pattern might continue. I will admit that in some ways we are probably currently in or reaching local minima, but that's always the case with anything. Any progress always encounters temporary setbacks and fluctuations, but that does not mean that the long-term picture can't be really inspiring. The book that got me really excited about this idea was Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard. Contrary to how it sounds, it's not actually about you personally finding enlightenment. It's actually referring to the age of enlightenment and the ideals that it represented. It's a fantastic book, and I'm going to be referencing it a lot in this video, so if you're interested in learning more, definitely give it a read. And honestly, it's been a while since I read it cover to cover, so even when I don't reference him, I might be accidentally stealing some of his ideas. Alright, let's get into it by starting with the big question. Why is everyone so pessimistic? There are a lot of factors, but I want to cover 4 that I think are the most important. The first one is that news is almost always bad. I think it was Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, who made an interesting point that a lot of the most positive impact things in the world are deliberate, institutional, slow, and incremental. Whereas a lot of bad things that can happen are sudden, dramatic, and therefore very newsworthy. For example, my city could be destroyed by a large natural disaster tomorrow, but it's far less likely that a storm made of pure joy and love is going to hit my city and then suddenly everyone is twice as happy. It's like how building good health is a slow, deliberate process, whereas ruining your health by getting hit by a car could be a very sudden thing. So as far as I know, it's not just that news agencies are evil and they want to ruin your day or something. It's that bad news is, by its very nature, more dramatic and newsworthy. A lot of good things happen too, but it's very easy to forget that they exist. This is also a problem in our daily lives where, for example, we don't appreciate how good our health is until suddenly we have to. All this being said though, news outlets do need to do better. Studies have shown that news organizations around the world have used more and more negative language over the years. And another study showed that viewers of all this negative news developed misperception of risk, anxiety, lower mood levels, learned helplessness, contempt and hostility towards others, desensitization, and so on and so forth.
I happened to be watching the news the other day, and I came across this story about some domestic terrorist who claimed like 12 lives or something. And to follow that, they contrasted it with a good story about some kid selling ice cream. I feel like this is something that a lot of people have noticed about news, and it really gives the impression that there is no good news to share, which just isn't true.
But here's a fantastic example by Steven Pinker. Wouldn't it be absolutely amazing if you turned on your phone this morning and saw this headline? 130,000 people lifted out of extreme poverty yesterday. What if I told you that that was the average number of people lifted out of extreme poverty every single day for the past 25 years? They could have put that basically every single day, but they didn't, and they won't, in part because it happened every single day. According to the World Bank, around 8.5% of people are still living in extreme poverty, and 44% of people around the world are still living in poverty. But compare that to the fact that 90% of the entire world was living in extreme poverty just a handful of generations ago. In 200 years, the rate of extreme poverty in the world has tanked from 90% to 10%, with almost half of that decline occurring in the last 35 years. In 2000, the United Nations laid out 8 Millennium Development Goals, their starting lines backdated to 1990. At the time, cynical observers of that underperforming organization dismissed the targets as aspirational boilerplate. Cut the global poverty rate in half, lifting 1 billion people out of poverty in 25 years? Yeah. But the world reached the goal 5 years ahead of schedule. Now, of course, lifted out of extreme poverty does not mean that they're now living in first world countries. A lot of them are still living in poverty. But it is a non-trivial improvement, and a significant portion of that progress was probably during your lifetime. These are important and inspiring numbers, but for some reason nobody that I've talked to has heard of them. The second reason is also a big one, and I think it goes a long way to explain why so many smart, informed people are doomers, especially when it comes to existential threats. When you're well informed, you are likely to know about all of the bad things that could happen: global warming, antimicrobial resistance, a big pandemic, supervolcano eruption, nuclear Armageddon, bioterrorism, an AI takeover, etc. It's good for us to recognize these threats. We can't work on them or improve the situation if we don't know about them. And these are undoubtedly some of humanity's most difficult problems, so it may seem like they're unsolvable. If any of these problems were easily solvable by you or me, we would have solved it and no one would be talking about it anymore. So what happens is that we're smart enough to think of these problems, but we're not individually smart enough to think of solutions. But that's okay, because the key word here is individually. It's okay that to me, AI alignment seems like an impossibly difficult problem, because humanity's greatest strength has always been our joint ability to solve problems when we need to. You might not think about it much, but we have a long history of solving seemingly unsolvable problems. Every generation of human beings has thought that there was a solid chance theirs might be the last one. Not that long ago, everyone was extremely worried about overpopulation. Fears began long before, but the book The Population Bomb, written in 1968 by Stanford professors, really popularized fears about an upcoming apocalypse. It predicted that in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death, and that it was already too late to do anything about it. A report titled The Limits to Growth, published in 1972 by a group of MIT researchers, discussed the use of a computer model to simulate the world's resources, and they predicted that the population would suddenly collapse. The following year, the president of the World Bank announced that the threat of overpopulation was just as bad as nuclear war. And a declassified 1974 CIA document warned that overpopulation could destabilize nations and lead to war. The president of the United States warned that an overpopulated Asia might lead swarms of desperate, starving Asians to sweep over the United States and take what we have. In 1960, 19 Nobel laureate scientists had made the claim that overpopulation could push the world into a dark age of human misery, famine, and undereducation, which could generate growing panic, exploding into wars. In the face of all this, it's not that crazy for someone to assume that this might be a big problem we have to solve in the 21st century. Instead, it kind of solved itself. Now, I'm not trying to discredit the Green Revolution or any other human innovations, but it turns out that in first world countries, people just don't want to have that many kids. In fact, now we're having so few kids that actually experts are warning about the exact opposite problem of underpopulation. And now they're warning that that might cause societal unrest and permanent economic damage. This sort of thing happens again and again. Here are some rapid fire examples. In the 1930s, drought and bad farming practices, like the destruction of prairie grasses, led to crazy huge dust storms. Many people believed that the plains would become a permanent desert and that America would completely run out of food. Instead, they reformed their practices and much of the land recovered. In the 1970s, scientists discovered that CFCs were damaging the ozone layer, which blocks UV rays from the sun. Some experts predicted that if not addressed, huge percentages of the population would get cancer, become blind, and starve. Instead, we banned CFCs, and now the ozone layer is on track to fully recover. In the 70s and 80s, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions created acid rain. We believed that forests would completely die out in Europe and North America. Lakes would turn into pools of acid, and crops would fail. Instead, we strictly regulated it, and things have mostly recovered. Take a look at this clip and try to predict what President Lyndon B. Johnson was talking about.
Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem that's unprecedented in our history. With the exception of preventing war, this is the greatest challenge that our country will face during our lifetime. It's a problem that we will not be able to solve in the next few years, and it's likely to get progressively worse through the rest of this century.
He was talking about oil here. In 1977, he predicted that in the 80s we would completely run out of oil, and look at how wrong he was. And the most triumphant of all, to me at least, is smallpox. It absolutely blows my mind that this isn't talked about more. But a little bit of a warning here, I am going to show some pictures, because I feel like just abstractly talking about how terrible a disease is doesn't really get across just how scary it can be. So if you don't want to see that sort of thing, close your eyes for the next 20 seconds or so. So smallpox was an absolutely terrifying disease that killed between 20 and 60% of everyone it infected, and up to 80% of children that it infected. It was single-handedly responsible for centuries of epidemics throughout all of history and all around the world, including around a third of Japan's entire population at one point, and later devastating the indigenous peoples of America. It has been with us all the way up until the 1950s, when it was estimated that 50 million people were still getting it every single year. We believed at the time that it was literally unstoppable and that no one would ever be safe from it. Instead, we created a vaccine for it, and it has become the first and only disease that humans have fully eradicated. The list goes on and on. And I wanted to add that in this section, I tried to stick to the more scientifically backed doomsday scenarios. I didn't include any of the many examples of religious predictions about the end of the world. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to make fun of experts or anyone who believe them. A lot of experts are right about a lot of things, and we should take heed when they give us warnings. The problem is that no one has ever dealt with any of these new existential threats, and so no one knows exactly how it's going to play out. Even though it might be hard for any of us to imagine how a single one of these problems could be solved, that doesn't mean that they're unsolvable. The worst thing you can do is give up. Some of the ones I mentioned might seem obviously wrong now, but try to keep in mind that it's possible, even likely, that in 60 years, your grandchildren will be laughing at you for thinking there is any chance AI might enslave humanity. Okay, that was a long detour, but if you haven't lost the plot yet, I want to go back to the main topic. So again, the second reason is that people are smart enough to know all the big problems that could happen, but not smart enough to individually think of solutions. And the third reason is just basic empathy. A lot of very empathetic young people who are very privileged are upset about the state of the world, and they're especially pessimistic about things that don't even affect them. They're depressed seemingly in solidarity with all the people who have it worse than them, and they're usually the ones who are annoyed at me for being happy, because they feel it's actually insensitive or morally wrong to be happy while others are suffering. I want to be clear though, I'm not hating on these people. In fact, I probably used to be one of them myself. I've changed my mind since then because from a pragmatic, utilitarian approach, it just doesn't really make sense for everyone to be depressed for everyone else. By all means, fight for people less privileged than you and take action when you can have an impact. But it just doesn't benefit anyone if everyone else's problems are always weighing on you all the time. If you really want to help, it's actually important to balance the desire for change with the knowledge that good people actually are having an impact on the world. If you allow yourself to become depressed and pessimistic, you're a lot more likely to just give up instead of working to make the world a better place. So I would argue that spreading optimism and hope is actually morally a lot better than the alternative. And just so you know, there's this pattern called the optimism gap that has been observed in a few studies. It basically says that people in every country underestimate the proportion of their compatriots who say they're happy by an average of 42 percentage points. So in short, don't be sad for everyone else. Everyone might not be as depressed as you think, and if they are, the best thing you can do for them is to spread hope. Okay, now I want to talk about the fourth reason, and this one is really important. Basically, your brain plays tricks on you in a few important ways. I'm going to talk about a few of the relevant and interesting ones here. But if you want to learn more about all the psychological shortcuts we use and how they cause all sorts of problems for us, Daniel Kahneman wrote all about his Nobel Prize-winning research in his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. One of the problems is that we are wired to pay more attention to the bad things that happen to us than to the good things. For example, if I give you $200 and take away $100, you are far less likely to be happy than if I just gave you $100 to begin with. This translates really heavily to our perception of the world. When we make progress, we are actually hurt far more by setbacks, even if they are relatively smaller. For example, it may seem like political polarization and bigotry are on the rise in recent years. But try to keep it in perspective. It's a local minimum, not a complete reversal of all of our progress. If the pendulum really was swinging all the way to the other direction, we would be on track to bring back slavery and women would be losing voting rights, but that's not happening. The reality is that we are living in the most accepting and compassionate era of all of human history. We are not past sexism and racism and every other ism, but we are farther along than we have ever been before. And I think that itself is worth something. Another error is that our brains make a lot of shortcuts. What that means is that when we don't sit down to actually work out the math, our brain defaults to heuristics, which are basically like these little mental shortcuts. We evolved to do them because it allows us to make split-second decisions without much mental effort. These heuristics would have worked really well for our ancestors, and they're still useful today for a lot of basic things. But in the modern day, they're not universally applicable. So what this means is that no matter how smart you are, Your instincts are actually really, really, really bad at statistics and probability. Even more so when we include things with exponential growth. I want to borrow an example from The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell to illustrate my point. Imagine I have a piece of paper like this one, except it's huge. Same thickness, but otherwise as large as I need it to be. Now imagine I fold in half. Once, twice, 3 times. What about 50 times? Obviously, each time I fold it, its thickness is doubling. So how thick do you think it will be after 50 folds? As tall as a phone book? A house? Once you've decided on a number, I want to take it a step further. I want you to decide on a range, with a minimum and a maximum, such that the range is as small as possible, but you're still 100% sure that the actual answer I tell you will be within your range. Okay, pause here if you need some more time to think about it. And I'm going to tell you the answer. The actual answer is that the height would be the distance from the Earth to the Sun. Studies done around this type of problem showed that the correct number was actually outside of people's ranges way more than it should have been. But apart from just showing how terrible we are at estimating numbers, it also shows us another problem, that we are often overly confident in the answers that we give. It reminds me of that Mark Twain quote that played at the start of The Big Short. Well, it turns out a lot of the stuff that we believe just ain't so. Take this example. Off the top of your head, do you think more people are killed in the US per year by lightning strikes or by school shooters? How many people do you think are killed by both? Well, it turns out from the numbers I found, there have been 142 deaths by school shootings since 2018, which averages out to just under 18 deaths per year. On the other hand, lightning strikes kill around 27 people per year in the US, according to the National Weather Service. So lightning strikes actually kill more people than school shootings. Obviously, I am oversimplifying here a little bit. This statistic doesn't account for the thousands of students who are traumatized or injured, but I still think it shows how skewed our perceptions are. Even knowing I was probably trying to trick you, it was probably difficult for you to reconcile the idea that lightning strikes could kill more people than school shooters, especially since we hear about school shootings all the time. The cause of this inconsistency is one of the heuristics we evolved, which is basically to assume that the more cases of something we can recall, the more we automatically assume that it actually must happen a lot. When I say it like this, it's obviously not true, but it actually probably served our ancestors quite well. If they could only recall one time that a giraffe accidentally killed one of their friends, but they could recall 10 times that a lion did, it was probably safe for them to assume that lions were more dangerous than giraffes. Where this starts to be a problem is that in the modern age, we don't just get our news from our own experience and a small group of people around us. News sources only want to report events that are rare, which causes us to see them more. But this results in the interesting and ironic situation where we only believe certain events are common if they're actually rare, and we only believe that events are rare if they're actually common. This helps to explain some of the stats I mentioned at the start, like why people always think crime is rising even when it's falling. This bias is really dangerous, especially when you combine it with some of the stuff I talked about earlier, like the fact that news is almost always bad. We end up believing that the world is constantly getting worse because all we hear about is bad news. And we end up severely overestimating the frequency of this bad stuff. I want to take another moment to reiterate though, I'm not trying to downplay any of this bad stuff. Obviously, the stats don't make you feel better if you are the victim of something like a violent crime. But try to keep in mind that there are literally millions of additional happy people walking around living their lives who otherwise would have been the victim of a violent crime, sexual assault, or driving incident if the world didn't get better. With regards to some of the more existential threats, some of the problems do solve themselves. But that is obviously not going to be true of everything. Completely eliminating smallpox was the result of a lot of really smart and cool people working really hard. But they had to believe that they could actually have an impact on the world, which doesn't happen if they're too pessimistic. So if you're going to take one thing away from this video, it's that you should stop lying in bed doom scrolling all day because you think everything is screwed. Yeah, I see you. Alright, but now you might be wondering, if even your own brain is playing tricks on you, how can you possibly learn the true state of the world? Well, Steven Pinker has a great answer to this question. You count. Though 13% of people in the developing world being undernourished is far too much, it's better than 35%, which was the level 45 years earlier, or, for that matter, 50%, an estimate for the entire world in 1947. So half the world was malnourished in 1947, and now only 13% of the developing world is. And this percentage fell dramatically despite the fact that at the same time we added 5 billion people to the world population. Though obesity is a problem, it's a lot less unhealthy than starvation. And I'm being really serious about that. I think in the modern age, people don't really recognize what famine really means. It's not just hungry, desperate, sick people, or even the images of sad, skinny children that you see on the internet. It is truly horrendous shit. Children being sold by their parents, collective suicides, entire cities littered with rotting corpses, and people eating the corpses, or desperately ripping open their neighbors' stomachs looking for half-digested food. I really just don't think that we're grateful enough about the fact that this could have been us if we were born just a few generations earlier. Obesity is, comparatively speaking, really not that big of a problem at all. It really is suffering from success, and compared to the absolute fucking horrors that every previous generation went through, we should be laughing and crying tears of joy that obesity is the biggest health concern of our generation. Here are some more. Even though it maybe doesn't feel like it sometimes, human compassion and altruism is at an all-time high in history. It has never been so normalized before. There have been massive strides for equality among genders, races, gay rights. Keep in mind that same-sex marriage was only legalized in all of the US in 2015 and 2005 for Canada. The world is changing really fast, and so it's not that surprising that we're not all on the same page about everything. This whole being a good person thing, on the grand scheme of things, is pretty new to us because it's the first time in history that survival isn't our main priority. So cut everyone some slack. Alright, more stats. People have more leisure time. 100 years ago, the average worker worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Time spent on just laundry fell from 11.5 hours per week in 1920 to whatever it is you spend now. Washing machines are something that we barely even think about, but actually, they've saved literally trillions of human hours since they were invented. This is just one example of all the cool stuff that we completely take for granted.
And everything is safer than it used to be. Even though driving accidents remain a significant cause of injury and death, over the last 100 or so years, we have become more than 90% less likely to die from it, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 92% less likely to burn to death, 90% less likely to drown, and so on. Even natural disasters aren't hitting like they used to. Natural disasters now only kill a quarter of the people that they used to every year.
You're probably upset about rising food prices lately, but keep in mind, incomes have grown so much faster than food prices that the average American household now spends less than half as much of its income on food as it did in the 1950s. Relative to wages, the price of food has declined more than 90% since the 19th century. Food has never been this easily accessible, and that's even considering the fact that almost half of all Americans 100 years ago worked in agriculture, whereas now the number is only about 2%.
The same is actually true of spending on necessities as a whole. Even though it has gotten worse lately, it is still a lot better than all previous generations. College and housing are, admittedly, getting much more expensive, but I just want to be clear before I move on that this is an outlier, not the norm. On its own, something like housing affordability is a very real but very solvable problem. I wanted to add here too that violence seems to be on the rise lately, and it has a lot of people concerned. But again, while I agree with most reasonable people that violence is bad, I want us to keep this in perspective a little bit. It was not that long ago that it was socially acceptable to have public torture and executions. The last person to be hanged publicly in the US was less than 100 years ago. This was considered not only acceptable for our justice system to do at the time, but 20,000 people went out of their way to watch it in person. It is possible that someone who is at this event is still alive today. So, while political violence is troubling, I think we should all appreciate just how far our standards as a society have come over the course of a single human lifetime. The slope on this curve of human improvement is really steep.
Here's one of my favorites that completely blew my mind when I heard it. Consider this, in 1900, 1% of American women giving birth died in labor. Today, the 5-year mortality rate for localized breast cancer is 1.2%. Being pregnant 100 years ago was almost as dangerous as having breast cancer is today. Let that sink in for a moment.
Now, the maternal mortality rate has gone down to 0.02% in the US, and that's considered bad among first world countries.
What about retirement? You might be worried about you or your parents' retirement. Well, being able to worry about retirement at all is a blessing, because it wasn't even really a concept until after World War II. Before then, you would just work and work until you died. These same promising numbers are true of so many things. Child labor is on the decline. Child mortality is on the decline. Diseases are on the decline. Schooling and literacy are up. And even though it's often claimed that democracy is under attack, in truth, the proportion of democracies worldwide is at or near an all-time high. Those are just some of my favorite stats from various sources, but if you're interested in learning more, Enlightenment Now would be a great place to start. He systematically goes through and analyzes like every metric you can think of. Lifespan, health, food, wealth, inequality, the environment, peace, safety, social spending, terrorism, democracy, equal rights, knowledge, quality of life, natural disasters, child labor, literacy, happiness, leisure time, existential threats, and so on. And virtually all of it is improving.
If you were to go around the world asking people what the most important things in life are, you'd probably get a lot of different answers. But there would be some obvious overlap. Not dying, food, health, freedom, money, labubu. Well, I'm happy to tell you that all of the most important stuff is, on average, getting better all the time. So even though it feels like politics has been crazy lately and the job market sucks, I hope you can see why I have such a big problem with the idea that the world is getting worse.
Okay, so the stats are looking good. I already talked about why I believe we'll be able to solve the existential stuff. But what about the stuff where we don't have numbers, where the numbers are unconvincing?
Let's start with war. I know that there are a bunch of wars going on right now, and the tensions between countries seems unstable, so this is an area people are particularly pessimistic about, especially nuclear war. But in that department, we're actually doing really well, all things considered. Virtually no political scientist in the 1950s could have dreamed that there would be 0 nuclear weapon deaths since the end of World War II. Even though it wasn't always smooth sailing, and still isn't, we should be at least somewhat proud of how we've handled it so far. As Husserl says, you don't have to be very imaginative to think that the most important news story of the past 70 years is what didn't happen. For non-nuclear war, the numbers form less of a clear trend than a lot of the other stats we've talked about, which kind of makes sense since wars stop and start all the time. All I can say though is that if you zoom out a little bit, even considering the wars that are currently going on, we are living in an unprecedented era of global world peace. The proportion of people on Earth who have to think about war on a daily basis is at a historic low. That is, as long as World War III doesn't happen. And until it does, I'm going to be optimistic that it won't. And the last thing I want to talk about is happiness. Some studies show happiness in America as having remained relatively constant over the past few decades, which can lead some more philosophically inclined people to wonder whether there is a point to any of it. There are tons of conflicting reports, and part of the problem is that happiness is a pretty difficult thing to measure. In Kahneman's book, he talks about how if you ask people how their dating lives are before you ask them about their happiness, then there seems to be a high correlation between happiness and their dating status. But if you just switch those two things around, suddenly there seems to be no correlation whatsoever. So asking people how happy they are seems to be not that reliable. And in terms of mental health, there's an argument to be made that it might only seem worse because people actually care about it now, are discussing it openly, are getting diagnoses and treatment, and so on, which are all good things. Some people claim that because we seem to return to some sort of baseline after good or bad things happen to us, that it's pointless to try and do better. But I would have 2 things to say to this. First, there are some studies and surveys showing that happiness is improving. And we do know that other poorer countries are getting happier as they get richer, and therefore more of their needs are being met. It appears wealth has diminishing returns though, which might explain why the US seems to be stagnating. Secondly, even if it was true that people are more unhappy, for whatever reason, let's say social comparison, loneliness, lacking greater purpose, I want to flip the script a little bit and ask, why wouldn't this be another problem that humanity is able to solve? As I've shown before, we're really good at solving big problems, and this might just be another problem that we solve once we learn enough about the brain. Humans are quite adaptable. Literally evolving isn't the only way that we can improve. We can also change our society and culture. Species change slowly, but cultures change quickly. And cultures actually pretty quickly start to build up antibodies to things over time. Think about smoking and how, despite how addictive it is, we as a society were pretty quickly able to adapt to it, and now smoking numbers are way down.
I know what you're thinking. What about vaping and Zins and all that other stuff? Well, I would argue that it's precisely because we develop antibodies so quickly that companies are forced to constantly repackage nicotine and find new ways to try and get the youth addicted to it. You would think that having it be highly addictive would be enough, but smoking is proof that it's not.
Now we're watching a similar thing happen as people realize they're way too addicted to their smartphones, and so we're developing ways of dealing with this. We'll probably see something similar with AI after a brief period of everyone being way too reliant on it. So yeah, I hope I've made my point. I really do strongly believe that we need to be highlighting our successes more often, because the positive feedback really does encourage all of us to do better. I was reading the book Effective Altruism by Peter Singer, and he talked about how the more often people see others being altruistic, the more they do it themselves. Organ donations are something that is following this pattern, though we are still in the early stages. But at the end of the day, just like everyone else, I have no clue how everything will turn out. Maybe World War III does start tomorrow, and by next week we're all extinct. Who knows? But the point of this video that I'm trying to get across is that the trend lines are going in the right direction, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes, or all the time. It's important to hold out hope for the future, because otherwise we won't fight to protect it. When you consume the news too much, people often become fatalistic, saying things like, why should I vote? It's not going to help. Or, I could donate money, but there's just going to be another kid who's starving next week. But the inspiring reality is that no, actually, we are running out of starving kids. And to be honest, being optimistic is just a nicer way to live life. It's not necessarily fun to be anxious and depressed all the time. I didn't know before that there were any other options, but now that I do, I wanted to share it with you. I kind of made this video with my younger self as a target audience because I would have wanted him to know that there are good things out there, and there are things we can be happy about if we look for them. Again, I know that none of this necessarily makes you feel better about whatever you're dealing with. Unfortunately, I can't use stats to prove that your life is going to be better over time. But I do want to talk about some of the things that have made me feel hopeless. I saw the news recently that young people are more unhappy relative to other ages than ever before, and that kind of makes sense based on what I see around me. My generation is in like depression levels of unemployment right now. A lot of us are told we need to go to college, even though it's insanely expensive, and then it often doesn't even help us find a job. We're surrounded by grifters on the internet, so all we see every day are people who got rich doing nothing of value, if not actively scamming people, and things just feel hopeless and pointless.
It also causes stuff like this, where Zoomers believe that to be considered successful, you need to be making almost $600,000 a year. Firstly, I wanted to say that economic troubles come and go, so I wouldn't stake too much expectation on how your life will be based on how it is right now. Secondly, I would urge other young people to consider whether it is truly so bad to work a job that pays the bills and makes the world a better place. I don't believe that working a humble job that incrementally improves the world is a waste of your life. In fact, it's those people who have, as an aggregate, done the most good for the world. I will admit a lot of this is as much a reminder to myself as it is a message to you. And another thing to the people out there who are like me, remember that it's okay to be aimless for now, because we're one of the first generations in humanity ever to be able to decide what we want to do with our lives. I don't know what you're going through, but consider whether any of the things I talked about might apply to your own life. Do you tend to put too much weight on the bad things that happen? Are there actually a lot of little ways that your life is improving that you don't appreciate? Do you dwell on the big problems you don't know how to solve instead of the little steps you can take to actually improve your life? I don't know, but maybe it's worth considering. And remember, there's scientific evidence that shows that helping others sometimes makes you happier than helping yourself. I know it sounds condescending and basic, but try doing something kind today for somebody that you love. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.